Hello. Friday. World news. We'll start with China and new business orders. This is their PMI, and the red line you can see has now gone below the 50 mark, which is contraction. The Market Watch HSBC's China Flash PMI points to contraction. Purchasing Managers Index fell to a 28-month low, 48.9 in July. This is probably actually very good news for China because they need to slow down a bit or inflation's going to get out of control. India's slowing as well, which is probably good for them. Brazil has just put its interest rates up again, which is very dangerous because it looks like it might not be even enough for Brazil and they might be getting out of control. But generally, a world slowdown would be good for the emerging markets because they're getting a bit hot. Japan, Financial Times Alphaville, not so fast, Japan, where we read that Chi-Wung Lee from Goldman Sachs' Global Economic Research team is not so sure about Japan bounding forward, writing that the supply side of the country's economy is circumventing power restrictions by extending production hours, which is fine, they're finding their way around things, but it is the demand side that is the problem. That is the world's problem at the moment on the demand side. Who is going to buy all the stuff? And down below, our US economics team has lowered its 2001 growth forecast to 2.3% from 2.5%. 2.3% is okay, but very, very nothing special. BBC News Scotland gives us number of Scottish people going bust rises by 25%. I think we're going to see a lot more of this in countries around the world as you get away from the main centres, either the capital or big cities. They're going to struggle for funds. It's going to be hard for them out on the peripheries to get hold of money, which I think is going to gravitate towards the major centres. Sticking with the UK, Ernst & Young and the item clubs and their 2011 forecast. The headline being, with a soft patch in the economy extending into the summer months. Soft patch. They pick up these ideas, don't they? These words of description. Soft patch. The item club has reduced its forecast for GDP growth this year from 1.8 down to 1.4. in line with figures for 2010. Growth remains subpar next year at 2.2. 2.2 again, it's growth, it's not bad, but it's not good enough. But then it's going to accelerate to 2.5 in 2013. Let's have a look at a few details of their projections. That's the 1.4 GDP growth that I've highlighted there in yellow. 2010, 2011, both the same, as they said, 1.4, not good at all, but they go for 2.2 next year, which should be enough to pay your debts, but nothing special at all. But then apparently it's going to increase in 2013 and 14, 2.5, 2.7. So where is this miracle going to come from? Domestic demand column, second along, we can see from 2008 at minus 0.2, then minus 4.3, and then 1.2, and it's down to 0.3 again now. Apparently is going to bound up to 1.6 and then two lots of 1.9. That's domestic demand. People are going to go buying things via consumer spending in the next column. Fixed investments, to make up GDP. We know what makes up GDP. It's run from 2008 minus 5, minus 15, 3.7. It's down to 2.4 at the moment. That's why GDP is low. But it's going to bound up. Business is going to buy all sorts of new this, that and the other to make things to sell to people. It's going to go up through 6, 7, 7.8. That's going to be really good. And we'll leave in exports and imports And the second projection boxes, net government borrowing is the first column. The line is 2011, the yellow line. We can see it was 2009-11, which is shocking, down to just under 10, and they project 7.8 for this year. I've seen projections nearer 9, but okay, give them that. And then look what the government borrowing is going to do. It's going to come down to 6, then 3.9, and then 2.8. Isn't that absolutely marvellous? So how is this miracle going to be accomplished? What should we look at? Current account average earnings, 2 at the moment, is going to go up. People are going to get a lot richer and get paid more. 2.3, 3, 3.1. Marvellous. Inflation, 4.5 at the moment, is going to go down to 2.5, 2.0 and 1.5. Marvellous, marvellous. Interest rate is going to go from 0.8 at the moment, funny number, 1.5, 2.5 and then 3.5. So the interest rate's going to crank up. And from that, we're going to get lower inflation, more earnings, more borrowing and spendings, and less borrowing and spending by the government. None of my money is going to bet on any of that happening. Joseph Stiglitz, writing in the Times today about the Eurozone's problems, which he says are political and not economic, which is a nonsense thing to say. Let's read it and then I might say why I think it's nonsense, but it's bloody obvious why it's nonsense. Europe faces a critical juncture on Thursday. Yesterday? One that may determine not only whether the euro will survive, but whether the global economy will be once again plunged into turmoil. We'll know by now. To an economist, what needs to be done is simple and clear. Nothing is ever simple and clear to economists. Greece's debt has to be brought to a sustainable level. Oh, well, if that's what we're talking about, simple and clear, well, yeah, that is, yeah. That can only be done by lowering the interest rate. I'm sure they will have done that. I'm sure they will have done that. And lowering its indebtedness, and or by increasing gross domestic product. So you can knock the interest rate down. You can knock it down to 0 if you like, but you then still need the money coming through to take out that money coming through to pay off interest. You need cash flow. Basically, you need growth to pay off your past debts. So it's very simple for him, and it's political, not economic. Yeah, well, the problems are economic because they're debts, they're debt contracts written on bits of paper, and that's economic if anything's ever economic. But yes, it's the politicians who've got to sort out whether those debt contracts are honoured or not. Mario Monti, not one of my favourite people. Eurobonds are the only answer to Europe's crisis. I'll read the first paragraph. Eurozone leaders face a fundamental choice when they meet on Thursday, yesterday. Either they declare, once again, that they stand ready to do whatever is necessary to overcome the Eurozone's crisis, or they actually do it. In the first case, markets are likely to step up to the next stage of their challenge to the European authorities. They will target larger countries such as Italy and Spain, thus making whatever necessary much more costly and ever less credible. So Monti reckons that Eurobonds are quite the thing. But I would bet that he hasn't a clue what it entails. I've just got a couple of comments from the Financial Times article that he wrote there. Mr. Awkward, which I thought was a good name. Could we please have a few specifics on the nature of the obligations behind the suggested Eurobond? As in, are they going to be a joint and several obligation of all Eurozone states or something else? And on the Eurobond, I'll just throw in that a joint and several obligation of the Eurozone states is completely against the law of the Eurozone at the moment. all the members would have to pass it through their parliaments. It's not going to happen tomorrow, and I doubt if they get it through their parliament, so it's just not going to happen. And Jean-Pierre Dumas says, Eurobonds, the only answer to Europe's crisis? Really? With the rich Euro countries, with public debt ratios all above 70% of GDP, and incidentally only 4 countries that are actually respecting the Maastricht regulations saying less than 60, and those countries are actually Finland, Luxembourg, Slovak Republic and Slovenia, who have just slipped in. And this is the point. Now the only solution is to invent a new debt instrument. You know, they've used up all the credit on that one, so we'll open up a new credit card, the Eurobond. No answer at all. Finish-ish with the Financial Times and a Bill Gross article, and this is the first time for months that I think he's written anything sensible. It's a well worth reading article. I think he's been burnt by his past recent predictions, which have been nonsense, and says developed world cannot thrive at stall speed, which is developing a very, very important basic concept. Debt is the disease, growth is the cure. But as the latter falters, that's growth falters, economies and their associated financial markets hang in the balance. In other words, they need the growth to pay the debts. And if they don't get the growth to pay the debts, then they're going to have to come up with some pretty whizzy ideas. Academics Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt have outlined what happens when countries assume liabilities that future growth cannot comfortably pay. 90% debt to gross domestic product is the Maginot line beyond which leverage dynamics begin to work in reverse, slowing growth instead of enabling it, promoting too much risk as opposed to potential gains. And so much of the Western world is approaching that 90% debt to GDP line. Growth will probably stall, and the paying of debts will stall as well. Later in the article, which I reiterate is worth reading, the expected negative real policy rate will influence much of the US Treasury curve as well. He's talking about, obviously, the United States, but everyone gets a mention in this article. Like a black hole, 25 basis point interest rates suck 2- and 5-year rates down with them, producing shockingly low returns that cannot possibly cope with higher inflation they produce. Alternatively, 30-year rates stay high for fear of inflationary consequences in future decades. The result is a dramatically steep yield curve. Now I'll do that backwards. Steep yield curve. Low interest rates at short-term borrowing, high long-term borrowing. Steep yield curve, excellent for banks because they borrow short and lend long. Alternative 30-year rates stay high for fear of inflationary consequences. With rates, short-term rates low, there is a fear of inflation. So the long-term rates, in other words, surely there's going to be some inflation over 10 years out. So I want big interest for the long-term rates. Diddly. And at the top, the expected negative real policy rate over the 2- and 5-year. You need to go out to 10 years on the interest on the treasuries to get above the inflation rate. So anything less than 10 years and you're having negative interest rates. In other words, any investment you make, you're going to be losing money to interest. At the end of the year, your money will have less buying power than it had when you invested it at the start of the year, unless you go right out to the end of the yield curve out towards 30 years, where you'll get interest rate which is above inflation, but you're taking a hell of a big bet. Let's finish with this. It's from Business Insider and one of their put together click through these charts, and this one is, here's the truth about what makes gold prices move, and there are 8 ideas in there, but there's only one that I really go with, and gold has an inverse relationship with real rates. In other words, as long as they're going to stick to this financial repression and keep interest rates low, below inflation rates, leading to real negative interest rates, the price of gold will continue to rise. And I think they're planning on having negative interest rates for the foreseeable future. Have a good weekend. Bye.